It's the early 1700s, and there's this poor English sailor named Samuel Bellamy who's about to become one of the richest and most successful pirates in history. We're talking about a dude who captured over 50 ships in just 1 year, commanded a crew of diverse outcasts, and went down with the largest pirate treasure ever discovered. This is the legend of Black Sam Bellamy, the Prince of Pirates, and trust me, this story's got everything: treasure, romance, betrayal, and tragedy. Let's dive right in. Chapter 1. From Sailor to Pirate Captain. Samuel Bellamy decided that autumn to leave the grassy shores and flickering taverns of Cape Cod. Townsfolk would later tell stories about how this poor English sailor said goodbye to a young and beautiful woman named Mary Hallett, a dear lover to whom he promised a return. Whether or not you want to believe these old and kind of sketchy romantic tales, Bellamy really did take to the sea with a crew, and something absolutely wicked had happened in the warm waters of Florida. Misfortune turned into fortune, beggars turned into kings, and honest men turned into villains. Here's what went down. Spain was demanding riches from her colonies on the regular. The economy of their entire global empire was loaded onto these massive, heavily armed galleons and sent back to the home country. Years of delaying voyages meant that this particular treasure fleet was way larger than usual. After departing from Havana, the ships ran into some seriously bad weather. Below decks, the cargo was rattling. We're talking tons of New World gold, silver, and gemstones, Spanish coins struck in the conquered capital of the Aztecs, plus Chinese porcelain and other Eastern treasures shipped from the Spanish Philippines. Then a hurricane started forming around the galleons. The shouts of sailors were drowned out by the screaming wind. Hulls tore against the reefs, and men spilled into the water by the dozens. All 10 of the Spanish ships were completely wrecked, scattered for miles along the Florida coast, along with the corpses of over 1,000 sailors and one of the greatest treasures ever lost at sea. Spanish authorities sent salvage crews to search the tides, while indigenous and African slaves were forced to dive the wrecks. Many died in the process. Word of this disaster soon escaped those shores, and by January, the coast was absolutely infested with treasure hunters prowling for riches. Our boy Bellamy arrived in the company of his friend Palsgrave Williams, who left behind a wife and children and a settled life as a New England silversmith just to join this voyage. The crew's efforts to dive the coast yielded pretty weak earnings, though. Around the same time, one Captain Henry Jennings, joined by the brutal Charles Vane and Edward England, attacked a Spanish salvage camp and sailed off with over 350,000 pieces of eight. A new Golden Age of Piracy was coming, and Sam Bellamy felt its call. Now, here's some context. The War of Spanish Succession had scarred Europe and its colonial possessions from 1701. Powers including England and the Dutch Republic went to war against France and Bourbon Spain over who should be the heir to the Spanish throne. The warring nations mobilized massive navies and encouraged sailors to become privateers, basically state-sanctioned pirates licensed to attack and plunder the non-combat vessels of enemy nations. The end of the war by 1714 brought poverty, though. The sudden flood of jobless sailors drove down wages, and those who found work often faced the brutal conditions of life as a merchant crewman, cruelly punished by captains, poorly fed, and routinely cheated out of their already tiny pay. Pirates, on the other hand, divided earnings way more equally and made decisions by committee. With relative ease, Bellamy and Williams gathered around 40 men to their cause. From a pair of sailing canoes, they began robbing merchants in the waters of Central America. They seized an English vessel, but while sailing toward Cuba with their prize, they were pursued by 4 sloops and had to flee. Bellamy then realized the men aboard the advancing fleet were fellow pirates. He approached their commander, the notorious Henry Jennings, and the 2 pirates formed an alliance to take a nearby French ship called the Sainte Marie. Bellamy led the assault. The pirates opened with scattered gunfire, and Bellamy shouted that he would massacre the crew if they resisted. They surrendered, and some of Jennings' men went aboard to secure the prize. Jennings then tortured some other Frenchmen to reveal the location of another vessel, the Mary Ann. He sent men to find and capture it, but then noticed that very ship cutting out to sea as the prize of his rival, the pirate Benjamin Hornigold. Jennings gave chase, but with his back turned, Bellamy and Williams overtook the Sainte Marie and, holding Jennings' men at gunpoint, stole the treasure for themselves, a haul worth 100 times the annual salary of a merchant captain. Pretty slick move. Betrayed by Bellamy and having failed in his hunt for Hornigold, Jennings set course for safer shores. A fort crowned by dormant cannons stood at the entrance of a harbor. Sailors hung around drinking wine and rum, while others hauled ashore indigo, sugar, cotton, tar, and gold, all of it stolen. When daylight faded, the men spent their coins in nasty taverns, gambling dens, and brothels. This was the pirate paradise of Nassau. The island had been almost entirely abandoned by the English during the war, so Benjamin Hornigold had established there a haven open to thieves, cutthroats, and smugglers. And it was Hornigold who now happened across Bellamy and Williams off the coast of Cuba. They admired the daring of young pirate Bellamy, so he merged the crews and made Bellamy captain of the Mary Ann. They were joined by the ruthless French pirate Olivier Levasseur, sometimes called La Buse the Buzzard. Under Hornigold's command, the 3 vessels spent the coming weeks raiding the seas for treasure. Hornigold then sailed to Nassau to replace his failing ship and returned to find that Bellamy and La Buse had plundered British vessels in his absence. Whether out of patriotism or self-preservation, Hornigold styled himself not as a pirate, but as a privateer still waging war against Great Britain's French and Spanish enemies. Sam Bellamy had completely disavowed loyalty to king and country, and the crew had gotten away richer because of it. So the matter was put to a vote. The crew elected Bellamy as their new captain, and Hornigold, along with a few of his supporters, including the bold Edward Teach, who'd later become Blackbeard, were sent away. Alongside La Buse, Bellamy and Williams continued to ravage trade routes. Bellamy took a new flagship and gave the Mary Ann to Williams, and the 3 vessels cruised south to rest for a few weeks on an island off South America, making repairs and drinking heavily. La Buse amicably left their company, and Williams and Bellamy headed to the Virgin Islands. There they rescued and added to their ranks some castaway French pirates. The crew had already been supplemented by sailors from victim vessels. Some volunteered to join the pirates, but Bellamy also forced others with useful talents like carpenters and surgeons to join his crew under threat of death. When they attempted to escape, he had them whipped. Harsh stuff. Victims of piracy almost always surrendered without resistance. Bellamy would take supplies, valuables, a few men to bolster the crew, and sail off. But dangerous ships lurked in these waters, and Bellamy wanted a craft capable of real battle. So now we get to the legendary ship. With 18 guns and ample cargo space, this wooden galley departed from Port Royal. She was named the Whydah, after the kingdom of Whydah, one of several West African states where millions of men, women, and children would be abducted from the interior and traded to European merchants. The Whydah was a slave ship, and having sold its African captives in Jamaica, the crew had cleared the hold of any corpses and filth and instead stowed the rewards of their long voyage: sugar, indigo, silver, and gold to be transported to London. The captain then spotted 2 ships in the distance. Day and night, they seemed to follow for hundreds of miles. The 2 vessels of Bellamy and Williams closed in and raised their black flags with death's heads and bones across them. The Whydah desperately fired a few shots from her stern before surrendering. The rowdy pirates overran the deck, and at a nearby island, Bellamy forced the crew to join his fleet. He gave the captain his old vessel, then added 10 guns to the Whydah and took it for himself. Now, this was a proper pirate ship. Bellamy's suddenly wealthy crew included Dutchmen and Irishmen, Scotsmen and Swedes, a number of black runaway slaves or freedmen, an indigenous American, and even a 9 or 10-year-old boy who had begged to join them. They dressed lavishly and left fear in their wake. A British colonial governor failed to make a report on the Virgin Islands, writing, "I would have gone, but had an account that the pirate ship and sloop commanded by Bellamy were still amongst these islands. For these reasons, and these only, I durst not venture down." Dude was straight up scared. Bellamy and Williams sailed north along the coast of British America, preying on many vessels, including that of one Captain Beer. Bellamy fancied himself a virtuous thief, so when his crew chose to burn Beer's sloop, he honored their vote but apologized to Beer, saying, "Damn my blood, I'm sorry they won't let you have your sloop again, for I scorn to do anyone a mischief when it is not for my advantage." Then the pirate's demeanor changed, though. "Damn you! You are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by laws which rich men have made for their own security. They vilify us, The scoundrels do, when there is only this difference between us. They rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the cover of our own courage. That's some powerful stuff right there. Basically a pirate manifesto. They burned his ship, and Williams took Captain Beer to dump him on Block Island, where Williams was also planning to visit family. He and Bellamy planned to meet up again on the desolate coast of what was then eastern Massachusetts, sometimes called Maine. Bellamy first set course for Cape Cod in late April of 1717 to restock and perhaps visit Mary Hallett. Rolling fog concealed the coast. Bellamy had put some of his crew aboard 3 ships he'd captured along the way, but as night fell, terrible winds separated the fleet. Rain pounded against the shifting deck. The Whydah was being pulled toward the coast, and Bellamy shouted to drop anchor. The anchors started dragging. The ship ran aground. The mast snapped, and waves pulled sailors from the deck, crushed them under cannons. The hull split open. The Whydah galley and over 100 men were lost in storm. Only 9 sailors on the Whydah that night made it to shore. One of Bellamy's prize vessels had also run aground. 7 of her crew were arrested. In addition to the Whydah survivors, Williams cruised the Maine coast awaiting Bellamy. It would be weeks before he went to Cape Cod and learned the tragic fate of his friend. Of the survivors, 2 carpenters were acquitted for having been forced into piracy, and the indigenous Central American pilot of the Whydah was likely sold into slavery. The remaining 6 sat in their cells. There was talk that pirates, including Edward Teach, now the feared Captain Blackbeard, would take revenge if the pirates were executed, but the inmates held no hope of rescue. They were instead visited often by Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister who had decades earlier supported the Salem witch trials. He begged them to seek divine forgiveness, and in the end, he accompanied the 6 companions of Sam Bellamy to the water's edge and watched them hang. Mather wrote, "Such madness, go to the dead. Behold, reader, the end of piracy." But the last stand at Nassau and the final exploits of Hornigold, Jennings, Charles Vane, and Blackbeard were yet to be written. Williams would return to Nassau and sail again with La Buse. And the story of Mary Hallett became this dark legend among the people of Cape Cod. It was said that after Bellamy left, she learned she was pregnant with his child, but the infant was found dead. Mary was accused of murder and witchcraft. Scorned by the town, she became a recluse, a sorceress who supposedly conjured storms against passing ships, remembered as the Witch of Wellfleet. Whatever ridiculous tales circulated, there really was a Mary Hallett of Cape Cod who died in 1751, childless and unmarried. Finally, somewhere in the dark depths lay a pirate's tomb, sunken with a galley. For some time after the wreck, bits of cargo and the skeletal remains of her doomed crew were spit out of the abyss, but the ship remained lost for nearly 3 centuries. In 1984, she was found. Year by year, cannons, clothes, treasure, and shards of bone returned from the depths. The Whydah had gone down with her captain, Pirate Lord Sam Bellamy. So, yeah, that's the legendary story of Black Sam Bellamy, the Prince of Pirates. In just 1 year, he went from being a broke sailor to commanding the richest pirate fleet in history. His diverse crew, his Robin Hood philosophy, and his tragic end make him one of the most fascinating figures of the Golden Age of Piracy. The Whydah remains the only authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered, and they're still pulling up artifacts today. Pretty incredible when you think about it. If you're into pirate history and stories of adventure on the high seas, this is definitely one for the books. Stay curious, everyone. Peace out.